Good morning, everybody. And I join Panisha in thanking the members of the festival for creating a space of exchange that is called a festival, right? A space of abundance and joyousness, where we also become mutually smarter and where I feel deeply welcomed into the community of artists and also into the space, this very interesting and strange space and complex space called America, the United States of. And I am indeed going to take up Panisha's generous invitation to read to you first, and then we'll have a conversation that I will find even more interesting. Give. Before dawn, low voices briefly loud. My father and his friend, the ambulance driver, his days off always in the middle of the week, drive away from the house with thick sandwiches and a flask of tea, and my father's green and white fishing rod whipping the wind behind the '76 Corolla. Camping by the sea, we'd see him take his rod further down the beach, walk waist-deep into the water, plant himself with legs apart in the breakers, reach back, cast the line baited with chokka and pull, giving, then tightening the line, nudging its weighted stream of gut to the fish. But in this place on the west coast they never disclosed. They stand unwatched, out of reach of each other's hands, and at their backs a fire on the beach, not stemming the dark, but deepening it. Often it would come to nothing, their planting and pulling, but sometimes the leather cups holding the ends of their fishing rods strained as they bent back against the high howl of the reels, being run to their limit and holding. Bowing forward and giving, and leaning back and pulling, their bodies make a slow dance nobody sees. And at home, the scraping of scales from Kalyun and yellowtail, and slitting the silver slick of skin to make thick steaks for supper, setting aside the cater for breakfast, the head for soup, and the gills and fat for the cats, while they tell us how they landed them. I wonder about the empty days, more frequent, that solitary standing in the dark at the edge of something vast, sea and sky, throwing a thin line into the give of it, and waiting, silent and waiting, until something pulls against your weight. That was a tribute to my father and to memory, and so often to what we can only understand when it's no longer there. I became a writer, a poet, once I left South Africa, and there's something about loss and the distance of loss that made me a writer. Without it, without loss, without distance, I wouldn't have been. I would have been fulfilled, I think, in other ways, but there's something about being fractured from what has been your root. That is a creative space. And because my life has become infinitely more mobile since entering the United States, and I've entered a culture that is infinitely more mobile, I imagine we must all be creative people and writers in this space. My mother, who has to enter the picture since my father just did, is about this size. My father and she would be introduced on entering a room as Dr. Jardine and spouse. And people would go up to my father, tall, imposing man, and introduce themselves eagerly to him. Say, Dr. Jardine, what a pleasure to meet you. And my mother would turn to them and, from her height and say, actually, I'm Dr. Jardine, but I'm very pleased to meet you. She loved playing that trick on people. Wears a scarf on her head, looks demure. But this is the story she told me about studying at the same university I studied at 30 years later. It's the University of Cape Town, as we like to say, the best university on the continent. I'm sure it isn't. I'm sure there are other universities who are equally good. My mother studied medicine. She was a child, the youngest of a working-class family. And when it was my turn to study, because she had studied something as useful as medicine, I could study something as useless as literature. So this is a tribute to what she enabled, but also what she did at that space, which in the 1950s was not welcoming to someone like her. I forget to look. The photograph of my mother at her desk in the 50s has been in my purse for 20 years. Its paper faded, browning, the scalloped edge bent, then straightened. The color of her dress folds discreetly. The angle of her neck looks as though someone has called her from far away. She was the first in her family to take the bus from Claremont up the hill to the university. But at one point during the lectures at medical school, black students had to pack their notes, get up, and walk past the ascending rows of desks out of the theatre. Behind the closed door, in an autopsy black students were not meant to see, the uncovering and cutting of white skin. Under the knife, the skin, the mystery of sameness. In a world that defined how black and white could look at each other, touch each other, my mother looks back, her poise unmarred. Every time I open my purse, she is there, so familiar, I forget to look at her. What are the stories that animate poetry? It turns out a vanishingly few, and so inevitably I'm going to read you a love poem. But I'm also going to read you a poem about arriving at love. When I read love poems, it ends up that I read the entire spectrum, including political poems, documentary poems. So when the extremely narrow range of themes that animate poetry are manifested in poems, they end up sounding like, the 3,000-year corpus. Because love has always been an excuse to write about everything. Right? So I'm going to read you first a poem about, a very brief one indeed, that will allow perhaps us to understand the title of this gathering. So this is a poem about what it feels like when you hand your identity documents to an official, right? And many of us, this means perhaps entering a country, and you hand over your passport. But there are many occasions, of course, in which we do this. And because I live in South Africa, getting anywhere has always meant a journey. And unless I was visiting one of our neighboring countries, it meant traveling for at least 11 hours, arriving exhausted and almost inevitably guilty, and then being asked to hand over your passport. So this is a poem recording that. I cannot myself. To come to this country, my body must assemble itself into photographs and signatures. Among them, they will search for me. I must leave behind all uncertainties. I cannot myself be a question. Yes, you cannot yourself be a philosopher at the moment of being asked to account for yourself at a customs official's desk. But now let me read to you a much more conventional love poem. I arrived in this country 15 years ago for exactly one fall semester. But something happened which turned into a great geographical complication. And that is the subject of this poem. Love complicates your geography when you're an African falling in love with an American. Beginning. I turn a corner and see your face. Our lives spool out from that glance. I give up everything for this. I remember everything I've left behind. You pack your books on the shelf next to mine. On an envelope addressed to you, I write a list of groceries. You speak to me of your former loves. You tell me I am your first love. Before we start the middle of our lives together, before we contemplate leaving each other, seeding the subtle map of the bed, let us linger on this beginning. And then I'm going to read one last one before we start the conversation, because you can't actually leave a love story at the beginning. Old photographs. On my desk is a photograph of you, taken by the woman who loved you then. In some photos, her shadow falls in the foreground. In this one, her body is not that far from yours. Did you hold your head that way because she loved it? She is not invisible, not my enemy, nor even the past. I think I love the things she loved. Of all your old photographs, I wanted this one for its becoming. I think you were starting to turn your head a little, your eyes looking slightly to the side. Was this the beginning of leaving? Thank you.
It was really beautiful. I kind of want to go into it because, you know, from one writer to another, I know what it's like to write about family, the good, the bad, and the... And you spoke a little bit about your parents, the two towers, metaphorically and realistically, the two beautiful towers that they are. And so in the American South, we have this thing, you know, the Southerners say, tell us where your people are from. So I want to ask you about your mother and father and just kind of your history, if you can talk a little bit about that.
What a delightful question. I sometimes think that the best answer to a good question is long silence. This may, however, not be very intriguing for you. Where are my parents from? My father was a house husband before there were television shows about such things. My mother, as I mentioned, was a doctor. So I grew up with a vision of what men do and what women do that I think has given me a backbone for the rest of my life. The tenderness of men and the strength of women, and vice versa. A man who cooked, who made beds, who dressed the children. and a woman who earned the bread. And also, I was part of a generation where we actually didn't spend all of our lives working. That is, my parents came home from work in the afternoon, and we would then do things like visit friends. And do you remember that time? Why have we given it up so easily, right? Why are we working into the night? Which is another question. My parents are Muslim, I am Muslim, and I am the descendant of people who arrived in what eventually would become South Africa as slaves. And just recently, I have written about that history, which, because I grew up in it, didn't really strike me as particularly interesting at that time. But recently I've reflected upon what it means to be Muslim, African, and mobile. Those things don't always go comfortably together. And so I've taken it as a responsibility to talk about the specificity of South Africa's history, the reality of apartheid that would have classified me in particular ways, and then the 300-year reality that preceded apartheid, and how that longer history influences the history that we are most infamous for, but also the history of the past 20 years where we've been remaking a world. And my parents are foundational to that world. But like many people, I had to learn how to appreciate my parents and their role in my life.
Well, you said in your book, The Dream and the Body, The Dream in the Next Body, excuse me, you said that the dedication to your parents gave you the love of reading. And then you mentioned up there that, you know, you became this poet when you left South Africa. So I kind of want to know, especially in the worlds that you were raised in, and you were born in, and just all the histories, and then having to leave to take on this craft and take on this life. That's not a very easy life. How did that kind of go over with these two people who gave you this love of reading? Because I know for me, when I started in college, I was a pre-med major, and I stopped to be a poet, and my parents were like, they weren't too happy, let's just say that. So how did that go over when you decided that this was going to be your life?
I'm going to read you a poem in order to answer that. So here we are talking about politics, and we always come back to family. There's a lesson there. This is a poem inspired by my brother, and it's called True. To judge if a line is true, banish the error of parallax. Bring your eye as close as you can to the line itself and follow it. A master Tyler taught me this. People wish to walk where he has kneeled and smoothed the surface. They follow a line to its end and smile at its sweet geometry, how he has sutured the angles of a room. He transports his tools by bicycle, a bucket, a long plastic tube he fills with water to find a level mark, a cushion on which to kneel, a fine cotton cloth to wipe from the tiles the dust that colors his lashes at the end of the day. He knows how porcelain, terracotta, and marble hold the eye. He knows the effect of the weight of a foot on ceramic. Terracotta's warm dust cups your foot like leather. Porcelain will appear untouched all its life, and for this reason is also used in the mouth. To draw a true line on which to lay a tile, hold a chalked string fixed at one end of a room and whip it hard against the cement floor. With a blue grid, he shakes out the sheets of unordered space, folds them into squares, and lays them end on end. Under his knees, a room will become whole and clear. At night, he rides home over ground that rises and falls, as it never does under his hands. So my brother is the kind of person who would have made this building. And my mother was the only person in her family who went to university, and until I came along. And because I was clever like Panisha, of course I was going to become a doctor like my mother. In fact, growing up I thought all girls had to become doctors. And clearly boys could choose to stay at home, but girls, no. And then in late high school, no doubt what happened to you happened to me, which is that a teacher enchanted me into literature. And inevitably, a question arose, what are you going to do with that? And then I published this book. And at my first reading in Cape Town, I read that poem to an audience like you. Afterwards, somebody came up to me and said, you know, that poem you read about the bathroom, can you introduce me to your brother? I need to have my own remodeled. And I said to my family, that's why you study English. So, you know, you can provide employment to your family.
It's awesome. That is great. That's absolutely great. There's so much of your early life that you've talked about in these two books that I've read, and it's just so beautiful and charmed, and you seem like you were raised in a lot of magic. But then there's also this whole idea of apartheid and growing up in that. And so I wonder if you can kind of just talk about, because your life even now seems to be like you jump in between racial lines and social classes and the whole idea of gender here in the United States and the whole idea of gender in South Africa. It's just like you launch and you land in very different quarters and very different situations. And in speaking about apartheid, especially when we learned about, at least for me, learning about apartheid, I think is very different from probably what you feel. And, you know, I learned about it in school and I learned about it on television. And that's the gist of it. It wasn't something spoken in my everyday life. It wasn't something that really resonated. But for you, that's very different. So I want to take this opportunity to kind of put that word out there and kind of see where it lands with you.
Yes, what a large word. Apartness, separateness, which means that for somebody like me, my entire life was lived in a space that was entirely segregated. And for someone like you, who with a very close connection with the South, you'll know that that is not only a wounded space, right? So apartheid at the level of the governments and the state's laws meant that it was illegal for me to live in the same space as people classified to be different races. I say classified because there were families who were classified as separate things when they were not. Right? So there were families who were classified as black and colored and white, and they were forced to live separately. And I couldn't marry somebody of a different race. I wasn't born in the same hospital. I wasn't buried in the same burial grounds. It attempted, of course, to create a stark separation, which people were always living in ways that resisted separation, right? At the same time, what was it like to live in an entirely segregated space where I only saw other black people and a school where I only had my fellow students were black. It wasn't just a place of pain, because when you grow up in a situation where you've never known anything differently, you make your own dramas that occur in a space that you know. And I know this is true as well here in the United States, because I've spoken with people who also grew up in segregated spaces, and they were rich spaces, they were intellectually vibrant spaces, they were politically engaged spaces, and that's what it was like for me. It was also, of course, a wounded space. And I try to respect both of those elements. I try not to only, however, speak about it in one way or the other. And so, of course, the teacher who enchanted me into literature was one of the few white teachers at my school, and I always blame her for the fact that I ended up being one of those not real doctors, you know. My mother always points out, she's the real doctor. And how does one speak about the fact of complexity in a situation of political woundedness? That continues to be a challenge for me, and one that I hope to keep on struggling with, because I think the one great tragedy of our lives is how we've become addicted to a kind of simplicity, which doesn't do us justice. And so sometimes what I want about South Africa is for it not to be so legible. You know, there are so many things we share in common, right? Here, the civil rights struggle, there, the black consciousness and anti-apartheid struggle, the word colored, and the word native, the way in which black and white are set in opposition to each other. It seems almost too transparent and too knowable. And what I sometimes want to do is interrupt that a little bit and reach more for complexity. And that's, of course, what poetry and other forms of art allow.
Do you find yourself also facing that as a woman? Because, you know, on this side of the world, we might possibly think that women are treated very different here in this country than they are in South Africa. And you go constantly back and forth. Do you find the beauties and the struggles of being a woman in this country similar to that in South Africa? And I say that now because, you know, often I've been hearing in the media that basically the government, the politicians, and everything, there's an attack on women and our rights and our bodies and our choices. And so I just kind of wonder, is there really that much of a stark contrast between women here and women there and how we're treated?
Yes, you know, America was startlingly recognizable to me, partly because the British Actors' Equity Union boycotted South Africa, so we had no British television in South Africa, and as a result we had an abundance of American television. So I knew details about American life that I should not have known growing up in a province of South Africa. My country has the most progressive constitution in terms of gender and sexuality in the world. Right? It, far beyond this country, actually protects sexual orientation as a category of identity from discrimination. Women are represented at the highest levels of government, which has not yet happened here. The Deputy President has been a woman. We have levels of representation in our Houses of Parliament, at your House of Congress. That would be a dream here. And at the same time, part of what was recognizable about America to me was the disjuncture between the ideal and the practice. Right? So there are forms of recognition that I wish were not so palpable between our countries. But also, when I speak with South African women, my countrywomen who come here, we speak about walking at night in Cambridge on high heels on our cell phones, which would be an impossible fantasy in some parts of our cities back home, right? So, yes, both places are complicated, and I've learned how to be a woman in both places.
Well, how about the literary side of things? How would you compare, or maybe contrast, what it is to be a writer in South Africa and what it is to be a writer in the United States? Is there a difference? Because, you know, working in publishing, you know, we were talking about this just earlier. You know, one of the big issues that the Nobel Committee has with the United States is that we don't do enough translation. There has not been an American writer who has won a Nobel Prize since Toni Morrison, and I believe that was back in the 90s, the mid-90s. And so there's often, when the Nobel happens, which it just recently happened, there was a French writer who won it in October, the grievance is America is so insular in themselves. They don't do enough translation. They're not global. And it's like, wait, guys, it's America. Like, this is what we're built on. So I wonder, as a writer, what do you experience in terms of maybe similarities or differences?
This festival is a wonderful demonstration of the richness of the cultural realm in the United States. To have a festival of the humanities that is 25 years old is an extraordinary achievement for the city. I'm so delighted and envious. I will take lessons from this. So you have an extraordinarily well-developed artistic realm that at the same time is very little supported by your government. In South Africa, this is also the same, but we have a Ministry of Arts. Let's hear it for a Secretary of Arts and Culture in the United States. So, in some ways, being a poet in South Africa means that you, like here, have extraordinarily dedicated people who produce beautiful books. And there's a festival system that is lively, and there is an enchantment with the kinds of stories that we tell about our post-apartheid life and our longer history that is very new to me. When I was growing up, even to become educated meant to learn about T.S. Eliot, you know, actually, did you know that he was a European? But to know about the great Europeans, occasionally some Americans, but it was to educate it out of my attention to my local realities. And that has changed, so that many South Africans now actually buy, know about, venerate South African artists. We're also over-endowed with internationally known writers and artists. South Africa, relative to our population, for instance. The United States is simply a different universe, right? And the level of visibility, the infrastructure of culture, and at the same time, the individualization and the celebrity of culture, I think, are not advantages. And so I think there's always a benefit from exchange. I think what might be very interesting is for us indeed to have translation not only literarily, but in terms of our culture of culture, right? I wish very much for American artists and writers to travel as much as we travel here. And then let's gossip and learn and complain bitterly about the publicists at our publishers.
I'm there. I'm so there. You just name the time. And you know, that is, it is something that is absolutely necessary in us understanding kind of how this world works a little better, and then kind of coming to the conclusion that it's just not about us as an individual. It's, you know, if we're gonna make it, like, we gotta like share and play together and, you know, take turns. All the kind of things that you learned when you were a little bitty person are really coming into play, I think, as we get older. And one of the questions that I really wanted to ask, is, you know, Africa as a continent has been in the news a lot. And it has been in our media a lot. And with all the discussions and all the things and all the fears and all the seriousness and everything, I think there's been a lot of things that have been very, very much misconstrued. You know, as a continent, and you're from South Africa, but if we're just talking about Africa as a continent, I don't think it gets told the right way here. Like, there's some truth, but there's a lot of just, it's like blurry vision. And I want you to be able to talk about it. How can we really do better in understanding this great continent that, you know, to be quite honest, most people are not going to be able to visit Africa. That's the truth of it. And yet, this continent has a lot to do with our everyday living, more than we really talk about. So what can we do, not just the United States, but I think the rest of the world, to really understand this place where a lot of our history comes from, but then also a lot of our industries and everything are really dependent upon? How can we better understand to not be so clouded in judgment, I guess?
Thank you, Panisha. I'd like to nominate Panisha for the Ministry of Arts and Culture. That is a necessary and weighty question. I think it links to your earlier question about reciprocity, right, and comparison and translation. America is profoundly present on the African continent, and that brings a responsibility and an accountability. I think that has not been sufficiently reciprocal, right? People like me come to the United States too easily, in the sense that we contribute our enormous gifts and talents and skills here, and our countries, as a result, lose us. As I mentioned, my own geography came about because of love. But my vision of myself was always that I would contribute to my own country, which trained me, educated me, loved me, wounded me, as all of our countries do. So I mean, we come here easily, not of course because mobility is easy for Africans at all, but we come here easily because this is a place that has most flourished as a result of the way that our economies and our politics have been set up. So this is a place to aspire to reach. Now, a more responsible and mutual relation in this world would mean that our countries also would benefit equally. Right? That has not happened. And that should be a point of curiosity. Why is the world the way that it is? In the green room, just before Panisha and I entered here, we had an enchanted conversation about the state of the world. This is what we all should be doing. This is what a festival like this prompts us to do. Why is the world the way it is? And how might we make it more just? Right? And the relation between Africa and the rest of the world is part of that question. Of course, you must be talking about Ebola and the way that it has so profoundly damaged visions of people like myself. I have a friend who works in London. She's from Zimbabwe, and she's a working class woman who's saved for years to go back to her family in Zimbabwe, which she finally has been able to do. But she's been told by her employers that she will lose her job if she goes back to Africa. People from Guinea and Liberia and Sierra Leone face that even more profoundly, right? I think we must make our accountability and our empathy and our mutual responsibility to one another do better than that. Right? We know the histories of the countries that are most damaged. This alone is grounds for understanding. But why do we not know that Nigeria beat the 21-day quarantine before the United States and before Spain? That in fact, African countries are doing miraculous work in trying to contain a disease which, like many public health crises, is actually beyond their borders and in some ways a challenge to everyone's capacities. Right? I would like to stand for a relation between places that is more equitable and empathetic. And I think that conversations like these and art make that call even more powerfully than merely asking for it or politicians asking for it.
I think we all needed that. We just needed to hear that. So I just hope that, we can just be better than we were yesterday. Would you read one more poem for us, and then we would like to open it up to questions.
Speaking about governments, I have to keep up my South African documentation, which means every 5 years or so I have to renew my driver's license. This is what happened when I did so last time. Tell me what you see, an ode to Hillstar Traffic Department. In the small caravan parked permanently next to the traffic department, with a handwritten sign, ID photos taken here, its wheels rusted into place. The young old photographer with dreadlocks and a tired poet's face is shaking his head from side to side, muttering some version of no. "What kind of photographer are you?" asks a woman ahead of me. "You don't make the people smile." "I just do my job, lady, and then I get out of here." "You'd also be like this if you worked here." "No, you mustn't let them change you, my boy." I would be smiling. Yeah, maybe, for the first 2 months, but then they'll drive you crazy. Just before me in the caravan, a woman in a long black skirt and black veil unties the loop of fabric knotted at the back of her head, and her face briefly emerges. The young old photographer sees everything. Hundreds of unclaimed photos line the inside of his caravan, the making of identity interrupted and turned into small, sad signs of something else. We don't look at each other, so we look at the walls, at the faces no one came to collect. Someone stands and someone offers their seat. Exact change. I sit on the plastic bar stool and he takes my picture with a small digital camera like the one you take holiday photos with. No tripod except his legs and arms. The background behind me, the faded fawn of the caravan wall that disappears anyway in the end. Why do we all hate our ID photos? Our faces without spectacles, hair tucked behind the ears, eyes too wide. The moment our identity is being made. Back inside the hall and its plastic chairs, a man ahead of me presses his finger onto the ink blotter, 1,000,000 index fingers and left thumbs before him. Then he leans his chin and forehead against the eye test machine. "Tell me what you see," the officer says. To clean the ink from his thumb, she gives him a single piece of toilet paper, torn carefully at the perforated line. The photographer runs a small HP photo printer on a car battery, humming constantly, like the cues and the explanations and the promises of whatever keeps this government building working. In the last queue to pay for my temporary license, I slide the 4 photos, my ID book, completed form, and exact change into the metal slot under the glass. "Ma'am, put your left thumb on the ink pad and place it inside the block." She watches me sign in the right place and pastes a strip of sellotape over my name, fixing my identity for 6 months at least. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now open up to questions.
Why did you choose poetry instead of prose? Do you feel that poetry delves deeper into the human psyche? What was it that attracted you to poetry?
Thank you. You give me more credit than I deserve. Poetry chose me. I first came to the United States on a fellowship, and I was here to do research for my PhD. And during that time, I took a number of evening classes in yoga, drawing, pottery, and poetry. And I was an equal beginner at all of them and expected as much as I did from any of them. And it was poetry that refused to let me go and answered a question that I wasn't even aware I was asking. So it would have been smarter to write prose. It's easier to get an agent that way. But poetry decided for me.
My only experience really in South African literature, at least not for a long time, was Alan Paton's Cry of the Beloved Country. Is that a fair, I mean, an old, but fair kind of representation of things in South Africa at the time? And does it have any, is it viewed in South Africa as a, way we might view great American literature?
It's viewed as an important precedent, antecedent. It has a certain vision of black paternalism and a contained kind of liberal politics that is of its time. Now I would say that probably most people read J.M. Coetzee for a vision of South African literature, Nadine Gordimer, that only covers our Nobel Prizes. I think that contemporary literature does something much more gritty and difficult, and it's not as comforting. Cry the Beloved Country is, of course, filled with tragedy. I think there are ways in which the contemporary literature does something even more interesting than tragedy. It does something which leaves you with a certain hunger that also comes along with a certain disillusionment. So I highly recommend that you delve into not only the fantastic poetry which is included among 30,000 volumes here, but the novels, the prose, is extraordinarily rich. And by that I don't only mean the literary fiction, but read the comic fiction, read the genre fiction. South African popular literature at the moment is fascinating. Some of South Africans, in fact, set their works in Chicago. The novelist Lauren Bierkes has written a novel set here called The Shining Girls. So let's talk afterwards about the range of people who've come after Alan Paton and who I think would just enlighten a vision of a country that is too easily known in some ways, but as I've suggested, isn't.
I'm sort of curious what you think about, I mean, so many people who aren't South African, who meet South Africans, want to talk about essentially everything before 1994, and sort of the weight of apartheid is sort of enormous, right? And so, it's an interesting and important subject, but it can be sort of as if the country stopped, right, in 94. But I'm just sort of curious what you think about how to sort of essentially deal with that huge subject, which people outside of South Africa want to know about, but at the same time move beyond that subject and talk about insert contemporary South Africa into the conversation, because a lot of South Africans actually don't really want to talk that much about pre-94 and think, well, that was 20 years ago. The way that many Americans don't want to talk about essentially the 60s when it comes to racial conflict, right? Like,
clearly one has to read a poem. Pen. 3 days before my father died, I lost the silver pen with my name on it, a 21st birthday gift from my aunt that I had kept for almost 10 years. That day, supervising students in Khayelitsha putting up a netball hoop, I came home to ask to borrow his tools. We walked around the garage, and I ticked off the ladder, drill, nails, and screwdriver on my list, and he suggested I add a hammer and level. Somewhere between stacking and loading the car, I lost my pen without even noticing it had slipped from my hands. When I went home late that day, I negotiated with loss, as I always do, not going back to the garage to look for the pen in case it wasn't there, to keep its absence incomplete so it could come back one day. In 3 days, the impossible sequences of death. I went back over everything we'd said that day, and the years when we didn't speak, and the reconciliation, almost wordless, when we walked towards each other with our eyes down and wept while we hugged. The night he died, I felt the completeness of loss, of absence without negotiation. And yet, what was still there, that moving towards each other without looking. That is a very partial response to time travel in poetry. It always takes me to another time. I think in a way, poetry travels in time all the time. Whether we have imagined the future as much as we should, that is a good question. I haven't. But I will challenge myself about that. I certainly know that in writing about love, we travel into an ideal future, which doesn't yet exist. But thank you for challenging me in that. Yes, the reason that genre fiction is so interesting in South Africa at the moment is that it has invented the future in ways that don't accept that entrapment, in our more familiar stories, right? So read Lauren Beerkus, read Imran Kavadia, read Nadia Davids, read Zoe Wickham, read all these brilliant, brilliant novelists who are challenging the space that we've allowed South Africans to occupy.
I just want to interject one thing, because if we're talking about leading into the future, and I wonder if you could just very quickly tell us, because we're running out of time, your name. What does it mean? And is it something that has been carried forward?
My name means beloved, full moon. It's in Arabic, and it is spelled in a way that is very South African. So many people who speak Arabic won't recognize this as an Arabic name.
So the Habiba
means beloved.
And then
full moon, Badran, Badrun. But there's a poem about it which is also gives you the title. Thank you for prompting me to read it. Breath. Language is breath, is touch, is spit, is the silence before speaking. Russian. A woman learning Russian describes the new inclination of her head, her chest, her hands, the tightening of her upper lip like bee stings around the mouth, the muscular changes in her tongue, an invasion from the inside. Arabic. I teach you to say the first letter of my name, a sound between G and H, for which there is no letter in English. Breathe in. Take a sip of water. Breathe out. The sound of breath leaving the throat is the start of my name.
And with that name, I want to thank you for being an intersection for us as a human being, as an artist, as a citizen of the world. And on this beautiful Sunday, I want to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival. I want to thank the Poetry Foundation, and I want to thank this incredible community in this room in the city of Chicago for bringing this brilliant poet. Get home safe. Thank you. Happy Sunday.